The ballroom at Alderton House held 200 candles and 300 opinions, and on the night of the Marchioness of Alderton's winter assembly, both burned with equal brightness. Miss Cecily Farrow stood near the window embrasure, where the curtains were thick enough to absorb a woman who did not wish to be absorbed by the room, and she watched the season make its verdicts with the efficient cruelty of a court that never recessed. She had not meant for anyone to notice the gloves. They were her only pair of white evening gloves, and the kid leather at the left ring finger had split in October, and she had no money to replace them. She had instead taken 3 evenings and a length of ivory silk thread and covered the repair with a pattern of climbing vines and small rosebuds, each petal no larger than a fingernail, working by candlelight in the room she occupied at Lady Ashmore's townhouse. The work was careful. She had been careful all her life. Lady Dorothea Fenn noticed them within 10 minutes of Cecily's arrival in the ballroom. Lady Dorothea noticed everything that could be turned to her advantage, and she was standing close enough to Mrs. Arabella Crane that the comment she made was not quite a whisper. "Do look at the Ashmore companion's gloves," Lady Dorothea said, her voice carrying the precise pitch of studied pity. "She has embroidered over a tear, the poor creature. I suppose one must admire the industry, if not the effect." Crane looked and smiled and said nothing, which was its own kind of commentary. Cecily heard every word. She had grown accomplished at hearing things she was not meant to hear, which was among the less pleasant skills of her position. She straightened her spine by a degree so small that no one in the room would have catalogued it, and she looked out at the assembled season. With the particular expression she had developed for moments such as these, the one that communicated composed indifference without betraying the effort the composition required. She did not see the man who had stopped 3 feet behind her until the stillness of him registered against the general motion of the room. He was watching Lady Dorothea's retreating back, not watching Cecily, and his face held something that was not quite disapproval and not quite contempt, but sat in the small, cold territory between the two. He was tall and dark-haired, and wearing a coat of midnight blue that had been cut with a kind of precision that came from having a tailor who had learned his art in another century. His eyes, when they moved from Lady Dorothea to the window, were the gray of fog over water. He did not laugh. In a room of 200 candles and 300 opinions, she noticed that he did not laugh. She filed it away in the way she filed small, unexpected things, carefully, without drawing conclusions she had not earned the right to draw. The season, she told herself, was 9 more weeks. She had survived. Worse. She had been in London 4 months when the gloves became a matter of public record. Before that, before any of it, she had been a country vicar's daughter in the village of Cresham in Wiltshire, and her life there had been small and full and organized around her father's library and her mother's kitchen garden, and the particular pleasure of Sunday mornings when the light came through the church windows at an angle that made even the most ordinary Sunday feel like a ceremony. Her father, the Reverend Thomas Farrow, had died in the spring of the previous year quickly, and without sufficient warning, leaving behind a modest library, a kitchen garden that would not survive the autumn, and a daughter of 22 with no property, no income, and no prospects that the village of Cresham could supply. He had been a good man and a poor manager, which combination had been survivable while he lived, and catastrophic once he did not. The living passed to his curate. The house passed to the church. Cicely had 3 months, and the contents of her room and the quiet, sustained assistance of a letter of introduction from the bishop to Lady Ashmore, who had been a girlhood friend of Cecily's mother and who required a companion with good French and better nerves. Lady Ashmore was a woman of 60 and considerable kindness, whose husband had died 8 years earlier, and whose own children had married sensibly and moved to the country, and who found London both necessary and exhausting, and had been managing the contradiction for a decade with the help of a series of companions who left when they found better situations. She was not unkind to Cecily. She was not particularly curious about her either, which was its own species of kindness. Cecily read to her in the mornings, generally histories and occasionally the novels, that Lady Ashmore preferred to enjoy in the company of another voice rather than her own thoughts. She wrote her correspondence in the afternoons, seated at the small writing desk in the corner of Lady Ashmore's sitting room, while Lady Ashmore occupied the good chair by the window and worked at her netting, and the afternoons were quiet in a way that Cecily found manageable. The scratch of her own pen and the steady rhythm of the netting shuttle producing a kind of orderly silence she had learned to inhabit. She ate her meals in the morning room, alone or with Lady Ashmore, when Lady Ashmore had no engagements, and she had the small bedchamber at the back of the house that looked over the mews, and she had a quarter day in wages, and she had no complaints that could be honestly put into words. The position was a good one as positions went. She understood this. She had read enough of her father's correspondence with other clergymen, other families, other arrangements, to understand the gradations between good and merely survivable, and she did not confuse the two. She accompanied Lady Ashmore to the various assemblies and card parties and dinners that constituted the machinery of her employer's social life, and she sat in the particular chair that companions occupied, neither quite among the guests nor quite among the servants. And she observed the season with the careful attention of someone who understood that observation was the only currency she currently possessed. It was Mrs. Peel, Lady Ashmore's housekeeper, who had first seen the gloves in progress, who had stood in the doorway of Cecily's room on the 2nd October evening and watched with the unceremonious interest of a woman who considered herself entitled to know what was happening under her roof. "You'll ruin your eyes," Mrs. Peel had said. "The candle is adequate, Cecily," had said Mrs. Spess. Peel had looked at the work in progress, a half-completed vine along the ring finger, and her expression had shifted into something that was neither approval nor its opposite, but was paying attention, which from Mrs. Barr. Peel was not a negligible thing. "Your mother teach you that?" she said. "She taught me the pattern," Cecily said. "I adapted it, Mrs." Peel had said nothing further, which was also not negligible, and she had taken herself back to her domain below stairs. And 3 evenings later, when Cecily finished the work and held the gloves up to the candle to check the stitches, she had felt something that was not quite pride, but was adjacent to it. By particular satisfaction of a thing done well, by the only means available. The glove she had made during 3 October evenings in the light of a single candle, because the work required precision and she had trained herself to precision, and because the alternative was to sit in the ballrooms of London in damaged gloves and provide Lady Dorothea Fenn with even simpler ammunition. She had not anticipated that the embroidery itself would be the ammunition. That was the season's particular efficiency. She saw the Earl of Strafton again on a Wednesday morning at Lady Ashmore's regular receiving hour, when he arrived with his aunt, Lady Mildred Vane, who was one of Lady Ashmore's older friends and who visited twice monthly with the reliability of a postal schedule. He sat in the corner chair that Lady Ashmore's male visitors generally occupied, which positioned him at an angle to the room that allowed him to observe without appearing to observe, and Cecily, who had learned the same posture from necessity, recognized it with a small start of something she did not examine closely. He was introduced to her as the Earl of Strafton, and he said, "Miss Farrow," in a voice that was low and level and contained no particular inflection, and she said, "My lord," and returned to the small task she had been performing before the arrival of guests, which was the arrangement of Lady Ashmore's correspondence into 2 categories of urgency. He watched her arrange the letters. She knew he watched because she had learned to know when eyes were on her without needing to look, the way one learned to sense the direction of wind without lifting a hand. She did not look up. She finished the arrangement and placed the 2 stacks at the left corner of Lady Ashmore's writing desk, and when she finally allowed herself a glance toward the corner chair, he had returned his attention to his aunt's conversation with Lady Ashmore, and his face gave away nothing at all. Lady Mildred was telling Lady Ashmore about the Duchess of Waldenau's expected visit to London. The Duchess was a formidable person of 70 years, they agreed, and her taste in needlework was famous, and her arrival before Christmas was expected to produce considerable interest in the season's remaining weeks. Lady Ashmore said she hoped to secure an invitation to the reception at the Alderton residence. Lady Mildred said, "Edward," this last directed at the Earl, "might know something about it, given that Lord Alderton was a particular friend." "I know that the Duchess arrives next week," he said, and offered nothing further. And Lady Mildred had the expression of a woman accustomed to receiving this quantity of information from her nephew, and continuing regardless. Cecily poured tea. The Earl accepted his cup without looking at her, but his hand, when he took the saucer, was careful in a way that arrested her attention for a half-second, the deliberate avoidance of contact that was its own kind of noticing. She was returning to her chair when Lady Ashmore asked her in the distracted way she sometimes asked for things, whether she might fetch the small blue volume on needlework illustration from the shelf in the morning room, because Lady Mildred had expressed an interest. Cecily set down her own cup and went to find it, and on her return she passed through the doorway into the sitting room, at the same moment that the Earl of Strafton was leaving it by the same door, on some errand of his own, and they stopped within 3 feet of each other in the doorway, with the book between them and the noise of conversation. From the sitting room and the narrow passage of the corridor beyond, he stepped back to allow her through. It was the natural thing to do. He was taller than she had estimated from across a room, and the gesture of stepping back was not the negligent stepping back of a man creating perfunctory space, but the attentive kind, the kind where the body has registered something. "Thank you, my lord," she said, and moved past him and felt, at a distance of approximately 8 inches, the warmth of him, as a fact, a physical fact with no editorial content, the simple reality of proximity. She did not look at his face. She went back to the sitting room, delivered the book to Lady Ashmore, and sat down in her chair and was entirely composed, which required, for the first time in her 4 months in London, a degree of effort she had not previously needed for that particular activity. She heard him return to the corner chair. She did not look. She thought with considerable firmness about nothing in particular. She filed it away with the other thing. She drew no conclusions. 3 days later, at a morning gathering hosted by Mrs. Hartwell of Cavendish Square, she learned something about him that she had not known. The gathering was one of those arrangements that fell between morning call and luncheon, informal enough for children to be present, and Mrs. Poley, Hartwell's youngest daughter, a girl of 7 named Sophia, had been permitted to sit in the window seat during the latter portion of the visit on account of good behavior, and had torn the hem of her dress on the window ledge. The child did not cry, which Cecily noticed and silently approved, but she sat very still in the way of a child who has done something she considers calamitous and is waiting to find out how, calamitous, it will be counted. Cecily had a small packet of needles and thread in her reticule as she always did, because companions required small repairs to be executable at short notice. She excused herself from the main group without drawing particular attention, crossed to the window seat, and knelt beside Sophia without preamble. "May I?" she said quietly. The child looked at her needle, and then nodded with the solemnity of a person accepting rescue on uncertain terms. The hem was manageable. Cecily had it secure in 4 minutes, the stitches small enough to be invisible from any distance, and she tied the thread and broke it cleanly, and said, "There! No one will know unless you tell them." Sophia looked at the hem, and then at the gloves that Cecily was wearing, the same gloves, because she had only the one pair, the ivory silk vines catching the morning light at the window. "Did you make those?" the child asked. "I did," Cecily said. "They're the prettiest I've ever seen," Sophia said, with the comprehensive authority of 7 years. Cecily felt something move in her chest that she did not have a name for. "Thank you," she said. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and turned to return to the main gathering, and found that the Earl of Strafton was standing near the door to the morning room at an angle that meant he had seen the entire exchange. He was not concealing that he had seen it. He was simply standing, and his face was the controlled, grave face she had come to associate with him. But there was something else in it, something that lived below the level of what the face allowed itself, and she had a brief and disorienting sense that she had not been unobserved for the whole of those 4 minutes. She did not look away immediately, neither did he. Then Mrs. Hartwell called for the tea tray, and the moment closed, and she returned to her chair near Lady Ashmore and did not look toward the door again. If you are still with this story, you already know what the season does not yet know. Stay close. There is more at stake here than a pair of gloves. Stay. It was Lady Mildred Vane who told him about Eleanor. and the telling had happened years before she arrived in London. And it would be wrong to say the telling changed him. He had already been changed before the telling, changed in the months he spent in Portugal with the diplomatic mission, while Eleanor lay ill at Stratton Hall with a fever the physician could not arrest. He had received the letter 11 days after she was buried. He had loved Eleanor with the quiet, organized certainty that he loved most things, and he had believed that love required presence, required attendance, required the daily maintenance of showing up and remaining, and he had been absent at the only moment that counted, because his presence at the diplomatic talks had been considered necessary by people whose necessity he had trusted more than his own sense that something was wrong at home. She had written him twice during her illness, both letters composed with the particular calm of a woman who did not wish to alarm her husband. He had received neither until he was already too late. He kept her miniature in the breast pocket of his coat. He did not take it out during the day. He was aware of its presence in the way he was aware of most things he could not change, steadily and without drama. He had come to London because his aunt had asked him to, and because Stratton Hall in winter was a house that knew too precisely how many rooms were empty, and because he was 34 and could not sit with that knowledge indefinitely without it becoming something worse than grief. He had not come to London expecting anything. He had not expected her and her 4 minutes in the window seat. The garden party at Grosvenor Square on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of December was well attended. As garden parties went in weather that refused to decide between frost and damp, and Lady Ashmore elected to remain under the covered walkway, which placed Cecily in the position of standing near the stone balustrade with a cup of mulled wine she had not asked for, and a clear view of Lady Dorothea Fenn and her contingent of the season. She did not need a clear view of Lady Dorothea to hear her. "One sees Miss Farrow everywhere now," Lady Dorothea said, to no one in particular and everyone in the immediate vicinity, in the voice she used when she wanted the remark to travel. "She has quite made herself indispensable to poor Lady Ashmore. I suppose that is the ambition of the girl with the mended gloves." Indispensability. There was a laugh from Mrs. Crane. There was a more muted sound from 2 other women in the contingent, the ambiguous noise of people who found the remark enjoyable, but preferred not to be attributed with the enjoyment. Cecily did not turn around. The mulled wine was warm through the cup. She counted to 3, and then to 5, and then she looked out at the garden, with the expression she had trained herself to wear, the one that communicated that she had heard nothing and cared less. Behind her at a slight distance, she heard the crunch of gravel that indicated someone had moved away from the group at the balustrade. She did not look. A moment later, she heard Lady Dorothea's laugh cut short, in a way that suggested she had become aware of the proximity of someone whose opinion she valued differently than she valued Cecily's continued discomfort, and the group shifted its conversation to other topics with the efficiency of people who had long practice at redirecting. She still did not look. The back of her neck was aware of where he was, and it told her he was standing near enough to have heard every word, and that he had not moved away. He said nothing to her. He crossed to Lady Ashmore and made the appropriate inquiries about her health and the appropriate remarks about the weather. And Lady Ashmore was pleased and told him something about the Duchess of Valdenau's arrival, which was now 3 days off, and he listened with his grave, considered attention and said he believed the Duchess was a person of considerable discernment. Cecily listened to this exchange from 6 feet away and allowed herself one small, private observation, which was that he had moved away from Lady Dorothea's group precisely when he had, and that the placement of his decision was not accidental. She drew no conclusions. She was very tired of drawing no conclusions, but she had not yet earned the right. The anteroom attached to the east corridor of Alderton House was small enough to discourage conversation, and large enough to serve as a passage between the formal receiving rooms and the rest of the house, and Cecily was in it on the evening of the Duchess of Valdenau's reception because she had gone in search of Lady Ashmore's shawl, which a footman had said was in the small sitting room at the end of the east corridor, and she was returning through the anteroom when she heard Mrs. Crane's voice from the other side of the half-open door. She stopped. She had learned to stop at such moments. Information when one occupied her position was as useful as currency and considerably more reliable. But she will never be received now. Mrs. Crane was saying, in the tone of someone reviewing a judgment that has been thoroughly established. Lady Dorothea made certain of that at the Hartwell gathering last week. The girl with the mended gloves. She said it in front of Lady Hartwell herself, and Lady Hartwell told the Stanhopes, and the Stanhopes have told everyone of consequence. Whatever Lord Strafton's peculiar attention may be about, it will come to nothing. A man of his station does not attach himself to a vicar's daughter in service. The other voice she did not recognize said something too low to hear. Exactly, Mrs. Crane said. Whatever her gloves looked like, whatever the child said about them at Mrs. Hartwell's, it changes nothing. Lady Dorothea is the acknowledged authority on needlework in this room, and in this city, and everyone knows it. If Lady Dorothea says the work is the desperate industry of a woman who cannot afford proper gloves, that is what it will be remembered as. The Duchess has not seen the gloves. The Duchess is 70, and German, and here, for 3 days, whiz. It will not matter. Cecily stood in the anteroom with Lady Ashmore's shawl folded over her arm, and her hands very steady, and the quiet at the center of herself that she had been maintaining for 9 months growing a little thinner, a little more attended by something that was neither grief nor anger, but carried properties of both. She had not expected anything else. She had told herself she had not expected anything else. She had arranged her life around the principle of not expecting anything else. She thought about leaving London. She thought about it practically, in the way she thought about practical things. The letter she would write to Lady Ashmore, the very small amount of money she had saved, the quarter days accumulated over 4 months, the question of where one went, when one had been a vicar's daughter and then a companion, and the second category was no longer tenable. She thought about the village of Cresham, and whether the new curate's wife might need a woman to help with the parish school, or whether there was a family somewhere in the county that required a governess who had read Latin, and could teach the pianoforte and had very good nerves, newly excellent nerves. Nerves that had been honed by 4 months of standing in rooms like this one, and hearing what rooms like this one said. She thought about the Earl of Strafton, which she had been avoiding thinking about with great discipline for the past 3 weeks. And she permitted herself to think about him now because she was in an anteroom alone, and there was no one to observe the thinking. She thought about the doorway, the 8 inches, the warmth of him as a plain fact. She thought about his face when Lady Dorothea's voice had carried at the garden party, the small, controlled movement of his jaw, the decision he had made to move from the balustrade when he did. She thought about a man of 34, recently widowed, with a grey gaze and a particular stillness. And she thought about what Lord Strafton's peculiar attention might be about. And then she thought about a man of his station and a vicar's daughter in service. And the arithmetic was not complicated. She thought about the fact that she was 22, and had done everything correctly, and it had produced this, an anteroom in a house in London, someone else's shawl on her arm, and a woman behind a door confirming what she had always already known. Her throat was very steady. Her hands were very steady. She had been practicing steadiness for a long time, and it served her here as it had served her everywhere else, though it cost more here than it had cost before, and she was not entirely certain of its long-term supply. She lifted her chin by a degree so small that the candles on the wall brackets would not have noticed, and she walked through the anteroom and back toward the east corridor, and did not look at the half-open door. The Duchess of Valdenau arrived in the reception room at 9:30, preceded by her reputation, and followed by 2 attendants and a translator she did not use. She was a small woman of 70, with white hair dressed in the severe continental fashion, and she wore no jewels except a small brooch of garnets and gold at her throat, and her eyes moved across the assembled room with the patient authority of someone accustomed to finding what she was looking for. The room rearranged itself around her arrival. This was what rooms did in the presence of such persons. The Marchioness of Alderton made the introductions, and the Duchess acknowledged them with the measured grace of someone who had been in rooms like this for 50 years and found them neither impressive nor contemptible, but simply present. Cecily stood at the far side of the room near Lady Ashmore's chair, holding a cup of tea she had not drunk and wearing her gloves. because she always wore her gloves when there was any prospect of social occasion, and because she had nowhere to put them. She did not see the moment when the Duchess of Waldenau noticed her. She became aware of it only when the room around her shifted, in the particular way that rooms shift, when a person of supreme consequence has altered the direction of their attention. The Duchess had stopped at a distance of perhaps 8 feet, and she was looking at Cecily's hands. Cecily's hands were holding a teacup. The gloves covered them to the wrist. The ivory silk vines were visible in the candlelight, the small rosebuds along the knuckles, the climbing pattern that she had worked for 3 evenings to cover a tear at the ring finger of the left hand. "Come here," the Duchess said, in accented English. To no one in particular, but clearly to Cecily. Cecily crossed the 8 feet because there was nothing else to do. The room watched. The Duchess took Cecily's left hand in both of hers, the old hand strong and deliberate, and turned the glove toward the nearest branch of candles. She looked at the embroidery for a long moment, without speaking. Then she looked up at Cecily's face. "Who made this?" the Duchess said. "I did. Your Serene Highness?" Cecily said. "Show me the right hand." Cecily extended her right hand. The Duchess examined it with the same careful attention, the thumb moving along the stitches without disturbing them. And then she released both hands and said something in German to one of her attendants that Cecily could not parse. "The vine pattern," the Duchess said. "The spacing of the rosebuds. This is not improvised. You have done this before." "I have worked the pattern in several variations," Cecily said. "My mother's garden had climbing roses. I learned to observe them closely. I can see that." The Duchess's eyes did not move from her face. "I have a needlewoman in Waldenau who has been looking for something to do with the late Duke's wedding gloves. They are silk kid, and they have been in a box for 30 years, and every suggestion I have approved has been wrong." She paused. "The roses at the Waldenau summer house are pink. Small, very like these." Cecily felt the precise quality of the silence that had descended on the room and understood what was inside it. She did not look around. She kept her eyes on the Duchess. "I would be honored to offer the pattern," she said carefully, "if your Serene Highness would find it useful." I would like to borrow it," the Duchess said with the mild precision of someone accustomed to having mild precisions attended to. "And I would like to know your name." "Miss Cecily Farrow," Cecily said. She heard, at a distance she did not immediately quantify, the small shift that a room makes when a person has been named who was previously without name. Then Lady Dorothea's voice came from the left, from the contingent of women who had arranged themselves within convenient earshot of any potentially consequential conversation, and it carried the particular pitch of someone inserting themselves into a situation before the situation could conclude without them. "Your Serene Highness is very kind," Lady Dorothea said. "Miss Farrow's little gloves have been quite the subject of the season. A charming effort for a woman of her circumstances. Though if your Serene Highness is interested in the design, I might be of service. I introduced Miss Farrow to the pattern some months ago at an early gathering of the season, and she has worked it very capably." The room went very quiet. Cecily did not speak. She did not have to. The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It was a silence of the quality that holds when a falsehood has been uttered in a room that contains people who know it to be false. And the question of what will happen next is still being settled. Several guests near the fireplace had turned. 2 women near the piano had ceased their conversation mid-sentence. Lady Ashmore, across the room, had lowered her fan to her lap and was watching with the still, slightly elevated attention of a woman for whom this particular evening had become considerably more interesting than she had anticipated. The Duchess of Waldenau said nothing. She was looking at Lady Dorothea with the mild, patient expression of someone waiting to hear whether there would be more. There was not more. Lady Dorothea Fenn opened her mouth and closed it, and what she had been going to say remained unsaid, which was perhaps the most telling thing about it. She was a woman who was never without a sentence, when a sentence was required. The absence of one now was its own kind of confession, What happened next was that the Earl of Strafton moved. He had been standing at the perimeter of the conversation, as was his manner, neither close enough to be part of it, nor distant enough to be outside it, and he had been watching with the grey, considered attention she had come to recognize as his native expression. He crossed the room in 3 unhurried strides, and the room made way for him without being asked, which was what rooms did when someone moved through them with that quality of certainty. And he stopped at a point that placed him beside Cecily and between Lady Dorothea and the Duchess. He did not look at Lady Dorothea. He looked at the Duchess. "The pattern is Miss Farrow's," he said, his voice level, and carrying exactly as far as it needed to carry, "as am I." The silence after that was a different kind. It was not the silence of a falsehood hanging in the air. It was the silence of something settled. Cecily's heart was doing something unreasonable and involuntary that she chose not to examine in the current company. She was aware of him very precisely, of the midnight blue of his coat at the edge of her vision, of the absolute steadiness of him standing beside her, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her that this was what she had filed away and declined to name for the whole preceding length of the season, and that the filing had been correct, and the naming was only somewhat overdue. Lady Dorothea said nothing. Her fan, which she had been holding at the precise angle she always held it, descended by a fraction of an inch, the smallest possible displacement, but in that room, and in that moment, it might as well have been a flag dropped Mrs. Byell. Crane at her elbow looked away. The Duchess of Veldenau looked at the Earl of Strafton with the expression of a woman of 70 who had seen everything and found most of it confirming. Then she looked at Cecily. "Well," the Duchess said, with something that was perhaps satisfaction, perhaps the recognition of something that had been correctly completed, "you must tell me everything about the roses." Lady Mildred Vane said afterward to Lady Ashmore, in the carriage, that she had known for 3 weeks, and Lady Ashmore said she had suspected for 2, and Cecily sat between them and said nothing at all, which seemed to satisfy both women considerably. He had asked to speak with her before the carriage was called. The room had been reorganizing itself in the way rooms do after an event of consequence, small groups convening and dispersing and reconvening, and he had appeared at her shoulder with the deliberateness she had come to expect from him and said, very quietly, "Miss Farrow, will you walk with me to the terrace?" It was not a question. It was the kind of thing he said. She walked with him to the terrace, which was cold and lit by the spillage of light from the room behind them. And he stood at the balustrade and looked out at the winter garden, and was quiet for a moment, in the particular way he was quiet. Not the absence of something, but the controlled presence of it. "I must speak to Lady Ashmore," he said. "Before I say anything else, you should know that I understand I have not given you sufficient reason to hear me. With any confidence, I have been careful. I have been too careful. It is a fault I am aware of," she said. "You were not too careful at the reception." He looked at her then. "No," he said, "I was not." The terrace was cold enough that her breath was just visible in the air, and she could feel the chill at the tips of her fingers inside the gloves. And the light from the broom touched his face at an angle that let her see the thing that lived below the level of what his face usually allowed. The thing she had been filing away without drawing conclusions about for the whole of the past weeks. "I should tell you," he said, "that I have not spoken of such things since my wife died. I want you to understand that this is deliberate and not easy, and not a matter of convenience. I know about your wife," she said quietly. "Your aunt spoke of her. What did she tell you?" "That you were abroad. That the letter was late." He looked away from her, at the winter garden. His jaw had the quality she had catalogued in that earlier simpler moment by the ballroom window, the compression of a feeling that was being held with great care, because releasing it required more than the moment could hold. "I could not reach her," he said. "I made the calculation that others made for me, that my presence in Lisbon was necessary, that the physicians were attending her, that it was a fever, and fevers were managed. I made the calculation and I was wrong." "You were wrong about one thing," she said. "It does not make you wrong about everything." He was quiet. "You knew," she said. for a long time before the reception. You knew before the garden party at Grosvenor Square, I think. And you did not say anything. And you did not do anything that you could not have explained away as ordinary. And I told myself it meant nothing. I know what you told yourself, he said. I was not fair to you. I told myself I was being careful. I was afraid. She had not expected him to use that word. It sat between them in the cold air. Exposed and exact. The invitation to speak to Lady Ashmore was made the following morning, and Lady Ashmore received it with the placid satisfaction of a woman whose social instincts had been quietly operating through the whole preceding season, and who was quietly gratified to find them confirmed. She gave her blessing with warmth and a certain briskness that suggested she found extended sentiment on the matter unnecessary, and told Cecily afterward that she had written to her children that morning, and they were uniformly pleased. The solicitor was a Mr. Argy Pendleton, who arrived at Strafton's townhouse on the following Tuesday, and who reviewed the terms of the proposed settlement with the efficiency of a man who had drawn up a great number of such documents and found them congenial. Lady Mildred was present. Lady Ashmore was present. The terms were generous and specific, and Cecily signed her name where indicated and felt the particular quality of a document that is not the feeling, but is the thing that makes the feeling permanent and real. Lady Dorothea Fenn sent no congratulatory note, which was information of its own kind. Mrs. Crane sent a card, brief and correct, and Cecily read it once, and set it down, and did not pick it up again. It was simply the precise amount of attention the note deserved, which was the same precise amount she had learned to give to many things this season, and she was not sorry to find herself in the position of being able to calibrate it freely. The Duchess of Valdenau sent a note in her own hand in English, which said that she was glad to have met a woman who knew how to observe a rose closely, and that she hoped the gloves and their wearer would both be very well, and that she expected the pattern to arrive at Valdenau by spring. The house that Strafton kept at Newbury in Berkshire was a stone house with a south-facing garden and a library that wanted a great many new books and a morning room with windows that let in, the kind of light that made everything placed in them look like it had been there for years. Cecily arrived in January after the wedding at the small church in Kensington that held 12 people and was over before the frost had left the churchyard grass. Mrs. Peel, who had been Lady Ashmore's housekeeper and who had been persuaded by some arrangement Cecily did not know the specifics of to transfer her loyalties to Strafton House, informed her on the first morning that the library's shelves were catastrophically organized and that something ought to be done about them, and Cecily said she agreed. And they agreed that it would be a project for February, when the roads were worse and there was less reason to be anywhere but indoors. He found her in the library on the evening of the second day, sitting at the desk near the window with a lamp and her work-basket, and she was working on a new pair of gloves, ivory kid, this pair untorn and unembroidered, and she was planning the vine pattern on the left hand, the small rosebuds at the knuckles, the climbing stems between. "For yourself," he said from the doorway. "For the Duchess," she said. She was very specific about the roses. "I promised by spring." He crossed to the desk and stood behind her and looked at the pattern she had sketched on the small piece of paper that served as her template, and then he looked at her hands, the hands that were holding the pencil and the thread, the hands that had worked 3 evenings by candlelight to cover a tear that the season had made into a verdict. And he said nothing, because he was the kind of man who understood that some things did not require words. The fire in the library hearth had burned down to a low, even warmth. Outside the window, the garden held the gray-blue quality of a January evening in Berkshire. The stone wall at the garden's edge, just visible in the last of the light, the bare branches of the climbing roses against it. She leaned back slightly into the warmth of him standing behind her chair, and he put one hand on her shoulder, and she felt the small, hard weight at his breast pocket shift as he bent slightly forward, and she thought of Eleanor, and of the miniature, and of the things that are carried forward not as grief displacing joy, but as the particular depth that loss gives to presence, the way a room is understood more completely when you have once stood outside it in the cold. The lamp was steady. The pattern on the small paper showed the first rosebud, just begun. She picked up the thread and measured out the length she needed for the next stem, and began. Thank you for sitting with this story until the end. If Cecily's quiet patience moved you, leave a word in the comments. She spent long enough being unheard.